And please welcome Chris Cayten, who's a partner and head of strategy at CodeGreen Solutions, another member of our committee who's always working hard to get people here to the conference and get some great content. So please welcome Chris.
Hello? No. How about now? Oh, look at that. That's amazing. Awesome. Thanks, Francis. Sorry, he's got to run. We'll talk bad about him after he leaves. First of all, welcome again. Thank you for sticking around. I know we are between you and cocktails if we can figure out where they happen. But this is great. I don't know, this may be like my 10th year here. This is fantastic to get everyone back together again after some breaks during the pandemic. So great event, Francis, for running this as he goes out the door. I don't think we said thank you to Francis. Can we say thank you to Francis? Before he leaves. All right, awesome. Let's get down to it. So this is a topic, I know, sustainability, energy efficiency. There have been a lot of things about sustainability in real estate that building owners and investors have been doing for decades just because it was good practice, even before it had kind of buzzword names about it. But I will introduce the group in a moment, but just wanted to sort of set the stage here that, so I've been doing this for about 15 years, looking at sustainability in existing commercial buildings, and what it first started out as, I have a trophy building, it needs to be green, can you save me a couple of bucks on my bills, has now bloomed into questions being asked at pretty much every step of a decision making in real estate, from building, buying, selling, financing. Now we're even talking about debt and how it's going to be impacting debt. So in the last couple of years, I'm not sure I'm a fan of how sustainability and energy efficiency have gotten rolled into now what is called ESG. I think it's a very broad term. There's pretty much nothing. If anyone here not heard of ESG? Amazing. See, that was not true 3 years ago, so here we are. But now that ESG encompasses, if people don't remember, environment, social, and governance practices within all types of companies, not just real estate, there's really nothing that it doesn't touch. So I think all of us have really come from the environmental side of this, energy efficiency, property management, really boots on the ground. So I think some of our discussion may stay at that level, but really all the people on the stage here have been doing this so long, you get elevated up to a point where you're making much bigger decisions. The two main things that I think will probably bookend the discussion today really are sticks that are coming from the local level. So in the US, cities like New York City have passed laws called, like in New York City, we have Local Law 97 that literally puts an emissions cap on every building that's over 25,000 square feet. And if you don't hit it, you pay a fine. So in the first time, there is now a price on carbon. In New York, it's $268 per metric ton. That's the biggest number I've ever seen. You know, carbon offset could be $1 somewhere. So that's the stick coming from the local level, which is these local penalties essentially in New York, DC, Boston, Denver, and like 40 cities, you know, essentially coming to a city near you are putting laws like this in place. And so for the first time, instead of just triggering energy efficiency during construction, which used to be the way energy efficiency was really mandated, was through building codes, 85% of the buildings that are going to be here in 2050, when we have to hit these net zero targets, are already here today. So in terms of solving the environmental issues and the emissions output of buildings, we have to solve the issue with existing buildings. And then the other side is really, I don't know if it's carrot or stick, but coming from investors, and I think we're going to talk more about it, coming from investors, now it's like 70% of institutional investors are now asking about ESG, asking about carbon emissions, asking these things of their JV partners, of their general partners at a local level. So we're really seeing both of those pieces coming together. So that's a little bit of the groundwork. I also would say it was amazing that our keynote, who was not asked to speak specifically about sustainability, about 40% of Francois's presentation was really about decarbonization and what we used to think of as sort of the wonky things in engineering and decarbonization. But the fact that now it's front and center at the C-suite level is kind of, we've been talking a lot for a very long time. We've all known each other for about 10 plus years, which is awesome. So that's a little bit of background. And now I think, you know, like I said, ESG is being discussed everywhere. So if I could have you each introduce yourselves, a little bit about what you do where you are, because you actually have sort of different seats. And Lauren, we'll see how your voice goes. So
yes, I'm sorry. I have lost my voice. This is the best it's been in a couple of days. I'm going to do my best, but thank you. Thanks for having me. So I'm the Chief Sustainability Officer at Vornado Realty. We are a public REIT headquartered in New York City, about 34 million square feet of space. Most of my work is in and around New York City, although we have one asset in Chicago and one asset in San Francisco. So, but we're a public company, so we have public goals around carbon neutrality. My job is really, I use sustainability and ESG sort of interchangeably. My job is to create and develop and roll out the strategy for us around ESG, working with our tenants, our investors, our building operators, our construction and design team. So it sort of runs the gamut across the work that we do. I do spend a lot of time thinking about social, even if it's not as popular or as sort of straightforward as the environmental piece, and the governance piece clearly is a part of where we sit when we talk with our investors and our lenders. We are mostly commercial office right now, so that is clearly a conversation we're constantly having with our investors, but it's about managing and maintaining stakeholder expectations and at the same time maintaining our role as sort of a leader in sustainability.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Eric Duchon. I am the head of ESG for Blackstone Real Estate globally. We are obviously the largest commercial owner of real estate in the world. We have 56 portfolio companies. At our core, we are a fiduciary to our investors. We build strong and resilient companies, and I say that because we believe that ESG interventions are aligned with that build of strong and resilient companies. So, in my role overseeing the ESG programs at these companies, I'm ensuring that their programs, their energy, their decarbonization, diversity, equity and inclusion, good governance programs are aligned with our core business strategies. You just heard from one of them, Parika, at April. Obviously, hearing that close alignment is extremely important to us at Blackstone, and ensuring that we're ensuring that ESG is tied to asset value and company value.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. I'm Jorge Lopez. I'm a senior associate with the global ESG team at Hines, which is a privately held, vertically integrated real estate organization, development, investment management, operations. So I worked with Chris for 7 years before joining Hines. And as he was saying, I think the journey has been moving from one-off, point sustainability work or initiative, going from building certifications to more comprehensive ESG programs. So Hines has been always interested in sustainability. I think Gerald Hines, when he founded the company, big thing he had was efficiency and managing and operating buildings to the best of his ability. So that has been within the company since its inception, and it has evolved. So moving away, obviously efficiency being a big thing and a big part of what we do, but now being a more integrated process, which we're trying to cover basically every function within the company, because it all touches ESG. ESG is everything under the sun, so yeah.
Great, thank you. Thanks for that. It's a great, like I said, I think where you sit within the organization, the scale of your organizations is kind of what I was hoping to get a little bit of counterpoint today. On that, some of you touched on it a little bit, but I wanted to get you start sort of macro around how has ESG changed, or from how your organizations approach it, say even, its inception into real estate was, I don't know, only 5 years ago or so, but how has it changed even maybe in the most recent, couple of years, either through the pandemic or where we are today, if any of you wanted to.
Sure. Chris, you mentioned earlier that we all come from the environmental side of things, and I think that's absolutely true. I started my career in property management operations, working on LEED certifications and LED lighting initiatives, right, when the lights were still purple. And today, ESG encompassing, as I mentioned, things like decarbonization, climate risk, social initiatives like diversity, equity, inclusion, stakeholder engagement in general, good governance programs, right, driving management and compliance at these firms, reporting and transparency of what we're doing. It really is that, you kind of said it too, right, like under the sun, we touch a lot. And I think from Blackstone's perspective, I've been with the firm for about 3 years now. When they were hiring me, they realized that there were a number of great pockets of initiatives happening all over the world. We have a lot of conviction in solar. We were doing a bunch of solar projects early on. The world was changing with the pandemic and with the murder of George Floyd. That led to developing a diversity, equity, and inclusion community of practice, right, to really spotlight the issue and recognize that we need to drive diversity into our companies because that results in stronger companies. I mentioned that's our primary objective. So I think that it's been a shift from like the pure environmental play on sustainability to sustainability being a little synonymous with ESG. I agree, sustainability is a better term, right? But we've seen this area grow, and we've needed to ensure that we're bringing the right resources in, because I am not a diversity expert, right? Devin Glenn at Blackstone, who is our chief diversity officer, she is, right? So bringing her expertise in and helping that inform how our companies are increasing diverse slates in our talent acquisition, right? Like that is really important. So one of the things that I like to think about with the evolution of ESG is finding the right experts and resources and really building the relationships across Blackstone, across the industry, across industries of all type, so we can bring those to our companies and make sure that they're implementing those types of practices.
That's great. Lauren, anything?
I would just add, I would add that I think data is a really interesting thing that's happened. So we always talk about data, either wanting to get data or having too much data. We spend a lot of time looking at data, but one of the things we've been working on for about the past year is this. I would add one thing to what you said, which is regulatory reporting is a big piece of what's going to start happening now, both in California, New York State, the SEC. So it's actually not going to just impact public companies, but impact companies across the country that do business in any of these states, and the reporting requirements around that. And so the idea of data and the validity of the data chain has become a really interesting part of how we do business. And it's meant that there's a lot of people at Vornado who didn't know what ESG was a couple of years ago, who now are really critical to the chain of work that we do, because they're ultimately going to be reporting on ESG like they report on financials. And that changes everything, right? I mean, I take it very seriously, my job, and I wouldn't want to put anything out there on behalf of Vornado, nor would they want me to. But when there's all of a sudden a sort of regulatory, the chief financial officer signing off on ESG reporting is a very different approach to the work. And I think it makes me happy, because then it's more people involved and invested in the work that we do, wanting to see us succeed, wanting to support us, bring in the experts that we need to continue to push forward with ESG and have it integrated. I think what Jorge was saying, like across the board, right? Every group now is responsible for it.
Yeah, well, you're holding more people accountable because their work and their data, their work and their accomplishments are being measured in a more structured way. I would say even from what you're saying, I probably, like you said, a little bit remiss in saying the other big elephant in the room is what many have probably heard about these pending SEC climate reporting regulations that keep getting kicked down the road. We'll see exactly what happens with that. California, like in many industries, said we're not waiting for the federal government, we're going to do it ourselves first, like they've done with cars and everything else. They literally passed like a month ago, right? Yep. In California, essentially, if you do more than $1 billion of business, you are going to need to report your scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. Yep. And if anyone follows just real quick, if anyone follows emissions, scope 1 emissions is what you combust on site, like fuels. Scope 2 emissions is energy that you use that someone else combusts, think electricity or other things. And then scope 3 is pretty much everything else, but it's primarily goods and services from your business. So scope 3 can become your entire supply chain, all of your vendors, all of that, the emissions that they produce. So, and how that hits real estate is interesting. It's not just you if you happen to meet that threshold as your own business in real estate, but you as a space that your customers and your tenants occupy as part of their business. That becomes their scope 3 emissions, which means they're now all of these companies that have to meet this requirement in California are now calling up their landlord and saying, what's my carbon footprint from being in your building? So first, that means that everyone's now going to be asking that question, and they're going to be going back and maybe calling folks like me and saying, can you tell me? Or if not, how can we get there? And then once you do tell them, and that tenant has space in your building and the tenant has space in, they've got one in each of your buildings, and they're like, well, why is it so high in this building and it's so low in that building? So just that, it's a great point on the data. Anything to add on that, Jorge?
Yeah, I'll just echo what both Eric and Lauren said. Regarding resourcing, I was the third person to join the global ESG team at Hines. We're now 8 of us, and we have a completely separate, we work with them a lot, but carbon strategy team, which is already 8 people, focus solely on net zero, on embodied carbon, on renewables, on data and analytics. So the explosion of people in very specific niches has been insane over the past couple of years. And then when it comes to data, big part, a lot of what Hines is doing, we're trying to revamp our investment process. A lot of it trying to figure out and getting data so we better understand what we're investing in. Over the past few months, we've changed our IC memo to include much more detailed ESG information, which a lot of our deal teams are really struggling to get. But the intention is that we have a better understanding of the whole picture, including the energy use intensity of an asset, how much money you would need in CapEx to maybe change a system that is not as efficient, and the story, social aspects, community aspects, et cetera. So a lot of the focus we've done, and something I've seen changing over the past few years, is how we're trying to embed ESG into the entire investment process of Hines and our investment management platform.
No, and that brings up a good sort of a little bit of a segue, which is there does seem to be a discussion. There was a great presentation I went to at Greenbuild a couple weeks ago where they talked about ESG being potentially more of a fund or a corporate idea and sustainability as being potentially an asset level initiative. Do you see, and I think there's a lot of rhetoric and there's a lot of talk out there saying, well, ESG is a distraction and it's confusing and it's potentially pulling people away from their fiduciary responsibility. How do you see ESG kind of come down to roost at the asset level? Like actually, because in a question, I'm an architect by training here for 7 years of my life. But a lot of people say, oh, well, ESG is only about the investors. It's not about building value at the building. So do you have any examples, or how would you, if somebody said that to you, oh, well, this is distracting, how are you showing value at an asset level that kind of touches on the ESG aspects?
I mean, we recently conducted a survey across our regions and some of our funds. So internal people asking them about what they saw or what they were seeing in transactions, so the impact of ESG in transactions. And we're starting to see some data. I don't know if people want to call it a green premium or a brown discount, but an example was an asset, a logistics asset in Germany, where François in his keynote spoke about CRREM, which is a carbon risk real estate monitor, which shows you, based on the market or the region, decarb pathways where an asset might strand from a carbon or energy perspective. So we're starting to see, especially in Europe, discounts for assets that are stranding really fast and where CapEx will be needed to bring them down to net zero. This particular example, I think it was a 4 million euro discount just to change a boiler because they needed to change a boiler to have the logistics asset be electrified and in line with that CRREM pathway.
Wild. Any other examples? Or?
Yeah, I mean, first, we're seeing a lot of the same stuff on the ground, especially coming out of Europe. And it's not just in Europe, it's coming out of Europe, and that European core buyers who are investing in the US or even in Asia are taking that kind of approach. They want EU taxonomy aligned or CRREM aligned assets that flow into their funds, which are then labeled by the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation. I could keep going on with the acronym soup of ESG and especially the European regulations, but that really is driving the way that they are evaluating their own acquisitions. And to Jorge's point, ensuring that you have to know everything that the way that we think about it is we need to know exactly what needs to be invested in this asset to decarbonize it, right? Especially around decarbonization right now, because if we don't, then the next buyer is going to discount us, right? And by the way, they're going to discount us probably double what the actual cost is. So it's definitely a matter of knowing that. And then I would say, when you just look at it, kind of take it out of the asset specific inference and then look at it more broadly, assets with strong ESG credentials or that have strong sustainability credentials, whether it's a certification or an energy efficiency label. Here we have US EPA Energy Star scores. They're operating more efficiently, right? That is just energy efficiency, right? Results in lower utility expenses, which results in higher NOI. They're more attractive for those reasons to most tenants, right? Most tenants want to be in a building with, you were saying this before, right? That doesn't compare poorly to another building that they're looking at from a leasing perspective. And then we're being rewarded, as we're saying, in capital markets, whether it's at exit like that or through financing. We can talk about that a little bit later as well. But you just kind of look at those three things, you say, this isn't a distraction. It's actually core to the business that we're running in real estate, right? And this is how we're ensuring that we're maintaining value, if not enhancing it.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. And Lauren, you're so much closer to these buildings, or I guess you and Jorge are very close to these buildings with your portfolio. At the asset level, do you find that it's easy to apply, or nothing's ever easy in real estate, but is it more direct to apply these types of initiatives at the asset level because you're walking these buildings every day and seeing them, or is it maybe harder because you see them face to face and say, I don't feel like doing this today?
I mean, I think it's both. I would say that it's funny because depending on the investor, if they're European or US, I get different questions around ESG, and the European investors are much more sophisticated. I think the tenants, we're starting to see in the RFPs a lot of questions around ESG, so much so that our brokers can't answer them without coming to me, which is a good thing, because otherwise I don't know how they would get answered. But what I would say is, one of the things we've spent a lot of time doing is we have a small portfolio, especially compared to them. So we have spent a lot of time with our building teams, sort of doing both the carrot and the stick, right? Which is the idea that in order to reach our goals, I need the buildings to perform. I need the building teams to execute on our vision. And that is like a non-negotiable. But teaching building teams how to do that, and Chris sees this all the time, is very, very hard. We have chief engineers who've been running buildings. The goal that most chief engineers were brought up with is property managers, it's that you walk into the lobby of a building and you're either hit by the cold or the hot, right? Like that is a sign of success in Class A office. If you're a chief engineer, it's that your tenants never complain. So you never change how you run that building because you do not want a complaint. A complaint is a failure. And what we have been teaching our chiefs and their building staff, one is, please, it's like going into a parking garage when you drive in and your eyes have to adjust to the dimming of the lights. That can happen as you walk into a building. You don't need to be hit by hot or cold. You can have gradations of an adjustment. Same thing with buildings, right? Look at the occupancy and then look at how you're running the buildings. And if you start to match those two together, you start to be able to find opportunities. And we all used to say, like Eric was talking about LEDs, like we were all sitting here going, well, the low-hanging fruit is done, right? It's done. We did the lighting. We're good. Low-hanging fruit is back. It's back. As much as construction costs have come up, things like controls in buildings have come down. So you can revisit low-hanging fruit, but that requires a lot of training. So we are doing a lot of training. We're doing a lot of rewarding, and we're also doing we're watching your buildings every single month and telling you who's doing well and who's not. And I went all the way up to our CEO to have this conversation so he gets that report also. So he can see the savings in buildings that are saving 5% or more a month in consumption reduction. He can also see where they're not. And that's like a big deal for us. And again, we're very small. So when I say this, I know the buildings. Like it's harder. I don't know if it's harder or easier to do it when you have that much more buildings.
I see two perspectives that Hines in the US is Hines property managers doing the entire work and operating the buildings. in Europe is third-party property managers, right? So for us, it's been really hard in the US to get the property managers to change how they operate the buildings and set them requirements or standards. It's really hard for them to adopt them because they, as you were saying, like they resist that change.
So the employees are harder to control than the third party.
The third parties is easier because you just set it in some sort of like service level requirement and you tell them you need to do X, Y, and Z. Otherwise, you don't get the job. So we have that leverage that we don't have with the properties we operate.
Interesting.
Yeah.
That's wild. I mean, so you bring up a good point. We'll spend a little bit of time specifically on this idea of decarbonization. Our new buzzword for reducing energy use and fuel switching and electrification. In terms of wanting to bring in probably at this point a little bit around kind of current market, status that we have, and this idea of decarbonization, essentially the play in real estate for real estate to contribute towards hitting global and national emissions targets and limits by net zero by pick a year, 2030, 2040, 2050. Essentially the play is to move all of your energy use to electricity and then source renewable electricity. So the thought there is you get rid of all on-site fossil fuel combustion, you move all of your usage to electric, and then you either hope, wish, pray, pay to get the grid to be greener. And so those two things together, of course, real estate doesn't own. Does Blackstone have energy? Do you have energy? You must have energy.
In our private equity.
Right. So typical building owners only play on one side of that fence. They're only on the demand side, and they pay their bills, and they sometimes, depending on where you operate buildings, can choose who they get their power from. But it's really a two-part process. But for decarbonization, even before we get to the grid and renewables, funding decarbonization, looking at funding, looking out sort of capital planning right now, in light of the financial sort of what we're seeing, is it shifting? Is it not shifting? I'm interested a little bit if people can remember that curve that Francois put up about CREM, this idea that you have to get onto a reduction kind of glide path, and there's a cost to do that, and it may be a multi-year cost. So I don't know, maybe Jorge, start with you again in terms of like how you think about decarbonization. Historically, building owners were saying, oh, if it's a 2-year payback or less, I'll do it, and if not, good luck. Yes, exactly, laughing. How do you think about decarbonization, funding decarbonization, also in light of kind of where we are in the market? Also you're very office heavy, so.
Yeah, very office heavy, but Hines is trying to diversify, but it is being required by our investors, it is being required by our tenants. It has to be funded. I think what we're trying to do on the Hines side is go a little bit into the more of like the investment intelligence side of things. So trying to quantify what's the actual value of the carbonizing a building, right? So if it's on the leasing transactions, you're going to get better tenants, you're going to get higher rents because tenants have their own net zero targets and they are looking for net zero space. We were doing some work with JLL and trying to identify the undersupply of net zero office space in major cities. And it seems that, New York, London, San Francisco, the list goes on, will have an undersupply of net zero carbon office space. So that's part of the value. That's part of how we'll pay for it, because you have those tenants saying, I'm not going to go to your building unless it's a net zero ready building.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome. Yeah, it's if you can start to pencil that out and actually get it on your balance sheet, get it in your pro forma and say whatever that uptick is, that can make all the difference.
Yeah. Well, I'll hit it from a different angle. As office is only 2% of our global portfolio these days. So and we're a very large logistics owner, obviously. Logistics, one thing you didn't talk about when you're talking about scopes of carbon is tenants are typically scope 3, right? Because we don't control the utility bills.
From your standpoint, yeah, they're your scope 3, right?
They're our scope 3 as the landlord. So in our large logistics portfolio, we really have to work with our tenants to ensure that we're providing them with the resources to decarbonize their buildings. The same goes for multifamily, really. There you have a little bit more control because a unit by unit kind of basis. But we did a similar survey, survey of our logistics tenants through our Link, our US platform, and resoundingly found that these tenants, other than kind of your large 3PLs out there, but most of them are smaller or kind of smaller shops, want our support. on decarbonizing their buildings, right? So they want us to take over their energy bill in many instances. In Texas, they got whacked 2 years ago by the winter freeze that sent their typical $1,000 to $2,000 monthly bill to $10,000, $50,000, right? They don't want to deal with that. They have no idea how to deal with that. They're very happy to turn those bills over to Link, as a landlord, and have them go out and procure energy on their behalf, right? That also gives us the opportunity, because we'll talk about procurement in a minute more, but that also gives us the opportunity to say, hey, you don't have LED lighting in here, right? Hey, you're leaving your bays wide open. There are controls these days that if you're not using those bays, you can have them shut automatically, right? So it gives us the opportunity to really help out the tenants with their own operations and help them lower their bills and decarbonize. Of course, that is very helpful when you're going to release that space. And logistics is, has been a very tight market, obviously, but you still want that additional support to make the tenant stickier.
Anything to add?
Yeah, I would just say that I think the tenant piece is a big deal. Our tenants are in our scope too.
Well, you control.
And the way that office owners do it is very sort of, you decide where your tenants go in some ways.
Standards are a challenge.
Yeah. But I think that from a decarbonization standpoint, one, I would add that New York City steam is going green. So we are embracing the steam system in New York City, even though it won't go green until 2040. And actually, it's a really interesting discussion then to have with investors, because what we've said to them is we're committed to the reduction in consumption of 50% over a 2009 basis. After that, whatever we do may be made up with RECs and offsets. And that the offsets, the RECs will diminish as the grid gets greener, but that the offsets are sort of a set thing until 2040 for us from a steam perspective. By 2040, most of the gas in our buildings would also be, we're trying to figure out how you make snapshots of information for everybody, right? So the tenants, the investors, to give them the data or the answer that helps them so that we don't get into the stranded asset. But we definitely are looking at certain buildings going, wow, what are we going to do there? Because it financially right now doesn't pencil out. Yeah. Now, if it means that the tenant is going to leave, it financially pencils out. And we have one building where we're making that investment because we know the tenant will not stay. And that's 1 million square feet of space in Midtown Manhattan. No one else will take that space then. That's the business case I've made, which is we will never find another 1 million square foot tenant to take that space if we don't decarbonize it. Yeah. So we might as well decarbonize it now and keep the tenant we have. That's a very simple, basic way of talking about it.
It's amazing that all three of you talked about this as a tenant demand. This isn't local law. This isn't even the investors, but actually the benefits are literally tenant attraction. On that note, maybe talk a little bit about non-office. I know there's a lot of multifamily folks in the room. Are we seeing any benefits for being a green or a net zero residential multifamily building? Are people flocking to them or paying more rents or anything?
Yeah, look, I don't personally believe in a green premium, as Jorge was saying. I do believe in the brown discount there. I was talking about logistics. I kind of cut across our entire portfolio. You heard Parika talking about affordable housing and the Inflation Reduction Act, tying affordability and energy efficiency. That's amazing. We're looking into it. You think about data centers. We're obviously going the news. Blackstone's all about AI and data centers right now. We're driving our PUE, which is the metric around efficiency, how efficiently you're cooling these spaces and data centers, driving that down as much as we can because the tenants in those spaces want highly efficient data centers that are sourced by renewable energy. It cuts across any property type you're in. I would say actually market rate multifamily is probably the least where you see it from a resident perspective. They want the most amenities, right? They're looking at it from more of like a health and wellness perspective. But when you can, show them that you're putting solar panels on your buildings and it's not just reducing one of the issues we've had with solar and multifamily is that you can only size it to common areas and drive down your own consumption. We're getting really smarter and more sophisticated on that, where we're allowed from a utility perspective, you allude to that, by actually making it such that we can pass through the benefit of the renewable energy to our residents in terms of saying this is green energy and you're getting it at a 10% discount, right? So that is going to be something that will be nice, especially in Southern California, where residents do care a little bit, and is where we're able to pilot that. So I really think as you cut across various property sectors, you just have to find where the needle mover is for the tenant or for the stakeholder, and pinpoint that and drive to it.
Gotcha. I know we don't have a lot more time, but we've been spending most of the time on kind of the opportunities and the benefits of sustainability and ESG, at the asset level and the investor side. Talk a little bit about, I know, in climate risk. So, in our industry, we talk about climate risk has two aspects. There's transitional risk, which essentially is kind of policies and purchasing trends that are moving away from your types of business. And then there's physical risk. We could spend, clearly we could have, a whole other hour on physical risk. But how does the idea of physical climate risk sort of factor into, I guess, your roles or decision making, and how do you knit it together with your sustainability initiatives, to drive value or even look at potential risks from a physical standpoint?
We're currently actually doing a big project related to climate risk. We're seeing it from two perspectives. The first one is asset level climate risk, so physical risks, as you were saying, flooding, wind, freezing in Texas, et cetera. And we're trying to, first of all, find a provider, which Eric was just saying, it doesn't care who you choose, but we have to do our due diligence, going through a bunch of list of different providers. And the intention is that we plug that climate risk information from the due diligence process and investment to our operating portfolio, et cetera. So we're doing that at the asset level, going through the process of identifying who will help us figure out what's going on. And then on the market level, we're also trying to have a more strategic approach on what markets we should stay away from a climate risk perspective, and have a better idea of strategic asset allocation, right? On where we should be investing, or where insurance might be a big issue for us. Mm-hmm. So we're undergoing that project. It's something we are hoping to deploy at some point next year, but it's still early on for us.
So we've screened our global portfolio, leveraging one of those providers, as I was saying. I actually did say I don't think it really matters which data set you use. They're all directional at this point. They're all pulling in what are called representative concentration pathways to like what business as usual would look like from an emissions perspective, which is basically doomsday in 2050. So it's all directional, right? And for us, when we screened our portfolio, what we've really realized is that we need to marry this data up with a few things. One is what is actually on the ground, right? These screenings that you're doing, similar to like natural catastrophe models for insurance, are just taking a geolocation and an asset value. Insurance uses total insured value. We use either that or asset value, and is giving you some want to give you a climate value at risk. We chose to not look at that. We chose to look at model cost of damage, like what is the impact of the event that's going to happen, but then it doesn't take into account the asset characteristics. And Lauren can definitely speak to this from Vornado's perspective, but I'll use logistics to differentiate a little bit. Logistics buildings are naturally built 6 feet off the ground because that is where a truck has to back into, right, to drop off the goods in it. That's pretty flood resistant already, right? Now, is it flood resistant enough is the question, right? And where is the water coming from? So that's the type of information that we're seeking in our portfolio, where we have identified directionally that we think are going to be greater at risk for any kind of flooding events, right? How do you do that? You don't just rely on the models that you have. You look at also what your insurance data is saying. Where have you had actual losses to date, right? Because that's ultimately what we care about in this environment, as you heard the panel before us talking about. Rising insurance rates really can hurt your bottom line, regardless of what property sector you're across. So we're combining all that information, the risk study that we did, our insurance information, and what's actually happening on the ground to help us inform a little bit more. And I think that insurance data isn't just our own insurance premiums, it's what's happening at disposition. We have a captive, we self-insure, no surprise. And but when we're going to sell assets in some places in Florida, right, the next buyer can't get insurance, right? So we're taking that and using it to inform our physical climate risk assessment as well. So this is one of those areas where I do think that, I don't think you can have enough data, but you have to use it wisely.
Thanks. Lauren, anything to add?
No, I would just say we're actually doing exactly the same thing, but on a much smaller scale. But I would say that all of the tools that are out there, what drives me nuts is they don't know the buildings, right? Yeah. And so I know the buildings, and we know where we've moved our mechanical equipment up, or we know what's happened in Superstorm Sandy. We know what's happened all the time throughout all of these. So it's about taking those tools. It's about taking the insurance information. We've now started, my team has started shadowing our insurance engineering tours to understand them. But yeah.
Well, and like we just co-invested together on a
right.
Yeah.
On the pier.
On the pier, right? On the west side of Manhattan, right?
Water.
A film studio, and everyone's like, "Why are you doing that?" Like
battery manufacturer on a river, yeah.
Yeah, right. Like, but we're reinforcing the structure. We're building it up, right? So we're taking all these risks into account and saying, like, this is a good investment that we think is resilient.